Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly. This is Two Broads Talking Politics, and the other broad on with me today is Kathleen Belew. Kathleen is an assistant professor of history at the University of Chicago and has edited a new book that is coming out, co-edited with Ramón Gutiérrez, called A Field Guide to White Supremacy. So hello, Kathleen.
Hi, Kelly. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. I have lots of questions about this book, but I want to start with a question I've been wanting to ask you for a while, which is you are a historian of the present. What does that mean?
Yeah. So, history of the present is something that people have played with a lot as a sort of methodology in the last few years and before that, of course. So when I say history of the present, what I'm talking about is the definition that comes from the scholar Lisa Lowe. And her argument is that history can do something, it's useful for where are we now and how did we get here, which is sort of the genealogy and map making part of history of the present. But it's also useful for locating new sort of possibilities for action that might not have been there if we didn't know that story. So I see it as both attempting to explain the present moment and also trying to expand future possibility.
And so historians, one of the things I think about is sort of the way that we define history is some about the methodology. So can you talk about what that means doing history of the present? What are your sources? How are you looking at this?
Sure. So I got to teach a class at UChicago on history of the present. And there what we did was sort of present the same sorts of stories I would ordinarily deliver in a 20th century history survey. But instead of doing it in chronological order, we sort of did it backward, which was in other words, we sort of used the headlines that week to talk about what would we like to understand more. And then used that as the jumping off point for what kind of historical context might inform the present. So for instance, instead of going in a linear way through the history of immigration to the United States, this was the year that Fox News ran that cry on about 3 Mexican countries contributing to immigration. So we did history of 3 Mexican countries. In other words, what are all of the things that had to happen to get to a point where someone would put on a television screen that people are coming from 3 Mexican countries? Because it's one of those moments that shows that there are a lot of things at work, So it's sort of like peeling back the layers on that and also thinking about all of the different ways that we might imagine more capacious categories of action if we know that history.
Then that, I think, helps sort of contextualize this new book that's coming out, Field Guide to White Supremacy. So let me start by asking where the idea for this came from, how you and Ramón Gutiérrez decided that this was the book that you wanted to create now.
So this came from a conference that Ramón started thinking about and brought me on to help co-organize at University of Chicago way back in the before times, before the last election, before the pandemic, before the George Floyd protests. And it began as sort of an academic project of bringing together people who are interested in racial violence and racial inequality, both historically and in the present moment. It turns out that those folks are often spread out quite a bit within the academy and don't always speak to each other. So for instance, the people who study the history of legal exclusion are in law schools. The people who are studying hate crime are usually in either social criminology or in ethnic studies programs, and the people who are studying history of lynching and hate crime are in history departments. So we began just by wanting to convene those people and see what we might have to offer each other. And it became clear really quickly from that conference and also from the press I was doing around my first book, Bring the War Home, which is about the white power movement, that journalists who cover these issues and activists who confront them in their own communities face a lot of the same roadblocks because there isn't really a sort of sense of a compendium of knowledge, a gathering point for all of this information and best practices. And early on, I picked up the Associated Press style book just out of curiosity because I was getting a lot of questions about just the basic structures of white power activism. And this is, of course, the style guide that is the sort of touch point for newsrooms all around the country. And I was startled to find that it had long entries for writing about ISIS, writing about Al Qaeda, even writing about the Irish Republican Army, which has not been in the headlines for quite a while. And it had nothing on the Klan, nothing on skinheads, nothing on neo-Nazism. It had one section on the alt-right, but one that was very outdated and unhelpful. And in many ways, we just didn't have any kind of book like this to help guide people who are coming into this reporting. And, thinking particularly about the white power movement, which is my area of research, we're talking about a social movement that's been with us since the Vietnam War and accounts for the largest domestic terrorism threat to the country, according to the FBI and DHS. And the fact that journalists aren't even able to name it and describe it is just, to me, a stunning lack of context.
So the book opens with exactly that, some thoughts on the Associated Press style book, with some suggestions for ways to talk about these things and think about these things. Are journalists your intended audience? Who all is the intended audience for this book?
So certainly this beginning section on the AP guide is specifically for journalists. And there's a lot of other things in here that I think will be helpful to journalists, particularly bringing together these scholars and creating what I hope will be a very, very highly useful index. Indexes can have a sort of broad range of how good they are at finding information. And we spent a lot of time on this volume trying to make sure that a non-specialist could pick up this book and find what they're looking for. And I think that, part of what we're doing for journalists is just the work of connecting people to the leading scholars in each of these areas. So for instance, they can pick this up and read a little bit about racial capitalism by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, read a little bit about deportation law by Adam Goodman, read about gender violence from Rebecca Solnit, just to name a few. These are the top thinkers in each of these areas. And in the footnotes of each of those pieces, they can go find more scholarship if they'd like to learn more for stories that they're reporting on. So it's sort of a first stopping point and jumping off point for journalists. But I also think that this book is really helpful for a broader audience, particularly for impacted communities, because one of the sort of tragic outcomes of the way that we have told these stories about racial violence and racial inequality is that these communities often don't realize how much they have in common with one another. And I think that putting these stories together in the same book can really open the way to coalitions and to new political possibilities.
So I suppose we should take a step back then for just a moment and define white supremacy, and how is it defined in this book in a way that brings all of these pieces together?
Absolutely. So maybe you will forgive me trying out an analogy that I've been fiddling with. So my first book, as I said, is about white power violence. That is overt racist people who say that they're racist and go out and commit acts of both individual and mass violence in support of racist ideological goals. Very straightforward. You can see where the racism is. It's very sort of simple to encounter. I think that what we want to think about is a big wooden fence that is in many ways standing in the way of a full exercise of American democracy. The racial violence or overt white supremacy is sort of like one plank in this fence. But then there's the whole rest of the fence. And the fence includes things like the way the legal system is set up in ways that disproportionately benefit white people, the way that incarceration disproportionately targets communities of color, the way that even in our medical outcomes, thinking about COVID and maternal and fetal death rate, those measures are incredibly unequal by race. You can go on and on. So I think this is a helpful way to think about it because individual racist belief is part of why the fence is there, but you don't need people to continue constructing the fence for there to continue to be a fence. So in other words, we're interested in this volume in the whole thing, the whole fence, not just the construction, although we talk about that, but also the systems where racial inequality is still perpetrated, even if nobody in the room is individually committed to a racist ideology. So an example of this from my first book is a shooting of leftist demonstrators by neo-Nazis and Klansmen in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1979. So the racial violence is part of why this was a horrific action. But the story that I tell about that event is not just about the racist actors who showed up and shot people that day. It's also about the way that the legal system failed to convict these actors, partly because of the way jury selection worked, the way that the law was written, the way that jury instruction worked. It's about the way that people told the story about what happened, which had to do with, white supremacy, both overt and covert in the reporting. And it's about the way that that set of events came together to intimidate an African-American community in Greensboro. All of that together is white supremacy. The racial violence is part of it, but it's not enough to simply stop racial violence. If we want to think about what a real democratic society would look like, we have to take down the fence.
One of the things I always wonder for people who work on this sort of thing, and I noticed that there's an essay in here by Jessica Ordaz, who I have also interviewed for my history podcast, and I asked her the same question, is sort of how do you protect yourself as you're doing this work? How do you emotionally guard yourself when you're doing this work that there is so much violence, there's so much hatred that you're writing about? And how do you make sure that that it doesn't sort of infect you in a way? And I don't mean like that you would become violent, but that it doesn't sort of drag you down with it.
Yeah, I mean, there are hard days in the archives about any of this for sure. And that's something that I think scholars who study these things ought to be in community about. But my sense of this from the beginning of writing Bring the War Home is that, as a white person who enjoys an enormous degree of privilege in our society, I get to choose to step into that feeling. There's a lot of communities of color who don't have that choice. And I also think that I just, maybe I'm an optimistic person this way, but I think that there is great reason to hope right now because people are really paying attention to a lot of this for the first time and in broad, sweeping ways, ranging from social mobilization to directing surveillance resources to solving the problem of white power terrorism, which I never thought I would see when I began Bring the War Home. And no one of these things will do it on its own, but I think that we really are at a moment of change. And I really do believe that learning and engaging the history can have an incredible impact. And of course, I don't have to tell you this, but being around the undergraduates at University of Chicago, it's really difficult not to feel that hope on the regular. I mean, they are so ready for the work ahead. And it's such a pleasure always to be able to take this work to the generation that will be taking it on.
Yeah. And I know that you are also a mom, and I see that with my kids as well. The interest they have in these things, the questions that they ask, and the sense they have of outrage when there's injustice that they and all of their friends seem to have. And that's really heartening, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it is. The kids are all right, and I think, I think also it's not just the kids are all right. I have to say that, like, even in this moment of incredibly intense political polarization, and please forgive me because I know that, I'm a historian. So when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I know that. But there really is, it seems to me, this huge crying out for history. Even Make America Great Again is a historical argument. It has to do with a periodization and a definition of actors and a whole bunch of other sort of assertions about, time and whether the past should or could be resurrected and for whom and who would be included and who would be excluded. Like, that's an argument we should have. I think that the United States is not so unique in its history of profound racial violence and racial inequality, but we are quite unique in how little we have had by the way of public sort of collective conversation about that history. We've not had a truth and reconciliation process. We've done very little in the way of museum and memorialization work around this, especially at the national level. And I think having those conversations is also the place where I really think a lot of this work could happen. because moving together with a shared story, I just think is an incredibly important element of building community.
So you mentioned at the top that this conference brought together people who come from different fields. That you and Ramón Gutiérrez are both historians, but these are not all historians, and that's certainly reflected in this volume. Could you talk a little bit about the people who contributed to the volume and the different ways that they're approaching these questions?
Absolutely, it's a really good example of kind of the best parts of an academic conference and the best parts of just going out and getting reprint permission for a bunch of pieces that were already out there. We were able to get some amazing work that I've been, for instance, a Rebecca Solnit essay that I have been teaching as part of the America and World Civ core curriculum for many years now is in this volume. There's a great piece by Jamel Bowie, who's now at the New York Times, but that we reprinted from Slate. So there are journalistic pieces like that. There are also like big, heavy think pieces by people like Judith Butler. And then we did some excerpts from widely read, renowned books from Keeanga Yamada Taylor, who, by the way, just won a MacArthur. Yes. And Adam Goodman, whose book was written up in the New York Times. And also some junior scholars like Jessica Ordaz and Carly Goodman. And I'm trying to think, who am I missing? Of course, Ramon's essays in this are amazing. There's legal work from Khaled Beydoun and Leo Chavez on media and Juan Perea on exclusion. It's just Simeon Mann on anti-Asian violence. I don't have this in front of me, and this is just off the top of my head. Who am I missing? Joseph Darda on the whiteness of the Blue Lives Matter movement. There's just a number of people who I think are sort of the most exciting people writing about each of these questions. And the chance to bring them all together in a volume was just such a fun experience to work on this one.
Yeah, and it makes for really interesting reading too. Of course, it's not the kind of book that you have to just pick up and read straight through. You can come back to it, but depending on the kind of mood you're in for the kind of piece that you're looking for, I enjoy reading across sort of a spectrum of different kinds of writing, and so I found that enjoyable as well.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad it was. And yeah, the idea is that this is a book that could sit on your shelf beside the Associated Press style book or beside something else that you're looking at, to just kind of deepen the context and history around what you're thinking about. And maybe you read only a little bit of it now and come back to it. And I think that's a great way to encounter this particular volume.
Toward the end of the piece, you have an essay called There Are No Lone Wolves, and you're talking about the white power movement. And I find this really fascinating that our look at so many of these events, like the Oklahoma City bombing that you mentioned, other things like that we do think about it and talk about it as if these are lone wolves acting alone. So can you talk just a little bit about your argument in that essay and the way that we can use that to sort of think through the stories we tell and the importance of how we frame them?
Absolutely. So just in recent years, what we've seen are these stories about the attack on Bible study worshipers in Charleston as anti-Black violence, the shooting of people at the Walmart in El Paso as anti-Latino violence, the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue as anti-Semitic violence, Christchurch as anti-Islamic violence. And they are those things, but all of those actions were perpetrated by people with ties to the white power movement, with ideologies that are clearly articulated in the manifestos that they wrote. And we are again now, I'm talking about the specific social movement that brought together neo-Nazis, Klansmen, skinheads, et cetera, the one we would now talk about as part of the militant right, the Oath Keepers, Three Percenters, Atomwaffen and the Base, Proud Boys, et cetera, are all part of this groundswell. So we read those stories about mass shooters as if they are single events. And part of the reason we do that is that this movement has been using a strategy since about 1983 called leaderless resistance, which is effectively cell-style terrorism. The idea is that one or a few people can act in common cause, but without direct ties with each other, and that they will therefore be able to perpetrate acts of violence that further the goals of the white power movement without, making it more difficult to prosecute them in court, more difficult to infiltrate and inform on the groups. But the big consequence of leaderless resistance has been exactly this problem in our collective understanding of what this is, because what we have are stories of lone wolf gunmen, quote unquote, instead of stories of people connected in a social movement working together, and in many cases working together to attack and overthrow the United States. This is not a few bad apples. This is a organized domestic terror revolution. It is small in number, but they have perpetrated enormous mass casualty events, including the Oklahoma City bombing, which is the largest event of that kind between Pearl Harbor and 9/11. And yet most of us are walking around with no idea of what that was or what it signified. So again, I think for me, this goes back to this question of coalition building, because if you think about the impacted places like Charleston and Pittsburgh and El Paso and Christchurch, those communities have differential levels of resources, of access to media, of access to public sympathy, of access to the judicial system. But they've all been attacked by the same movement. And I really think that were they to come together, were we to really understand how interlocking these acts of violence are, the outcomes can be different because these communities could join together. And I think nowhere is this more important than the way that we're treating January 6th, which is not exclusively about white power activism, but a highly organized part of the insurrectionists that day were white power activists. And understanding the history and context of that event is a crucial first step to pursuing justice.
Do you think, I mean, certainly we sort of writ large in society aren't thinking through the history of that. Do you think things like this congressional committee that's looking at it, or, you know, some of the think pieces in journalism, do you think there are people who are sort of looking back more at that history, or, you know, is this kind of a blind spot for us?
I think people are starting to. I mean, I've had the enormous privilege of Bring the War Home and this research to various people who work in surveillance and security, people in and outside of the government, watchdog organizations, and people are working on this problem from the NSA to the DHS to the FBI. People are starting to think about this in terms of infiltration in the armed services, in terms of what to do about monitoring local police departments. Both of those are kind of hotspots for recruitment and violence. And I think people are becoming quite aware of the problem. I think the challenge is that now white power is not a completely underground revolutionary movement. Now we're talking about something that's making inroads into mainstream politics. And of course, when we have our lawmakers saying things like, oh, January 6th was a normal tourist visit, or people who are just completely changing the meaning of the word insurrection in order to kind of dull the shock of January 6th. I mean, as a historian, I've just never seen that kind of erasure move so fast. And it's really stunning to witness. On the other hand, I feel like a lot of people were watching their television that day, and it's not so easily dismissed. So I don't know. I hope this committee can get somewhere. I see that they have begun the process of thinking about contempt of Congress for witnesses that don't provide testimony and records. I don't know enough about how all of that works to know what comes next, but I do think that was a very alarming event that is not the end point of activism, but is likely a beginning point for further activity. And I hope that people take it seriously for what it was.
So how can people get this book?
So this book is available from University of California Press. Right now I have a code on my Twitter for I think it's 30% off at Kathleen_Belew. It is also on all of your online booksellers. It is at the Seminary Co-op, and it is on Amazon and Kindle. And all of that comes out on Tuesday, except Kindle, I believe, is already there. So if you would like to get a jumpstart, I suppose you could do that now.
And everyone should get it before the supply chain issues affect it. If you want books, get them now.
Yes.
Is there anything else that you wanted to make sure we talk about?
I don't think so. Thank you very much for all the wonderful questions.
Thank you. This was it was great. I'm so pleased that I had a chance to look at the book, and I hope everyone will check it out.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Dimcast Podcast Network. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Wethlin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at twobroadstalk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.